In the past, we were capital-oriented. In fact, it is the way of the West. How about today to change to people-oriented, people-centered? It is necessary to coordinate the material and spiritual civilizations to achieve peaceful development. But most importantly, it is to turn to the harmonious coexistence of man and nature. Well, at this new stage of development, we are facing is a challenge to the multiple interest groups formed in the old stage. The war went on. But what about his manifestation from hot wars to cold wars? So we've analyzed the old Cold War before. During the old Cold War, what major changes have taken place in the structure of the world? It was also said that after the end of the old Cold War, standalone hegemony dominance, globalization of financial capital. Here's what actually happened. The confrontation between the two major financial capital groups in the United States and Europe. So we can call it the post-Cold War period. This post-Cold War phase, there are still a lot of localized hot wars, but mainly around Europe. We are now facing a new Cold War. New Cold War phase. The antagonism between China and the United States has become the main contradiction in the world. Although the Russian-Ukrainian conflict broke out in February 2022, then he still belongs to the post-Cold War. It might be the last war. The last hot war of the post-Cold War broke out still breaking out in Europe, driving massive capital outflows from Europe. But it didn't all go to the United States. A considerable part of it goes to China. This brings the relationship between China and the United States, opposites at the stage of financial capital, tighter. That's especially true now in China. The total amount of wealth is increasing. For the United States, it's life extending. We can't explicitly point out the next stage. What is the form of the conflict that is about to break out? But we at least know this and his contradiction, the intensity of the struggle. For any historical, I am afraid a war is not inferior. What about in this case? I think we should look further. It is an understanding of China's past development experience. Then we mainly focus on the physical industry. Of course, part of it are what about this capital start to expand into virtualization, especially in recent years. Real estate is called real estate capitalization. Leverage ratio leading to real estate capital. The leverage ratio of real estate has risen sharply. So, real estate capital versus financial capital, they form two interest groups with direct interests. Once guide the Chinese economy to a so-called high growth but actual virtualization. He is objectively absorbing too much currency. Slow down inflation in China. Or weaken such characteristics. But more importantly, it's social funding. They are flooding into the real estate market. And it causes all sorts of high social tensions. And actually destroyed China's original, the basic structure of the real economy. How about these? It's something that we've been paying a lot of attention to in recent years, but on the other hand, China's own national system. It still has the biggest advantage. Look at this in 2021. State-owned assets about 8 million renminbi. That's more than the rest of the world combined. China's total wealth is $120 trillion. That's way more than the current number. The total assets of state-owned non-financial enterprises, already 308.30 trillion. Total assets of state-owned financial enterprises, 352.40 trillion. That total state-owned assets of administrative units and institutions is 54.40 trillion. So, speaking of which, this one in China, country's 800 trillion assets. He is conditioned by the operation of the national system to effectively respond to internal and external crises. So, we said we came up with some theories, point of view, and I won't go into that. In my other books it's all there. So what do we say next? That's what the country is launching. It's a major transformation. What about our development over the past 100 years? It's a step-by-step process. Cross the river by feeling the stones. Whether it is the late Qing dynasty, of course, it is relatively conservative. The Republic of China is relatively radical. Since the 1950s, we started with the Soviet model. Since the 90s copy the American model and both of these objective outcomes of copying a dependency. What about dependent development for latecomer countries for the southern world? Is a huge cost. So what? In two ways, first Soviet and then American. In this copied way of development, we learned a lot, the price is also high. What about attachment? It should be for us. It's a dynamic that has to change. How about now we are moving towards something completely different from the northern countries, such a new strategy for the northern world. That's called ecological civilization. Therefore, we say that this is a major strategic adjustment of the country. Then this is transferred to ecological civilization. We need to consider, how can we move towards a harmonious coexistence between man and nature? So what? In the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party of China officially proposed the Chinese path to modernization. And it is completely synchronized with rural revitalization. It is mainly for the common prosperity of all Chinese people. So why? There is no experience to follow. Only people-oriented. In the past, we were capital-oriented. In fact, it is the way of the West. How about today to change to people-oriented, people-centered? It is necessary to coordinate the material and spiritual civilizations to achieve peaceful development. But most importantly, it is to turn to the harmonious coexistence of man and nature. Well, at this new stage of development, we are facing is a challenge to the multiple interest groups formed in the old stage. The old stage is industrialization plus cities plus financialization. That's the asset-heavy development model. We are now turning to ecological civilization. It is the development model that emphasizes ecology and light assets. Under the conditions of the global capital process, continue to be capital-oriented. Old ideas, of course, continue to tilt inputs and returns towards the few. It's the old paradigm. So look at the whole. We are meeting the challenges of globalization today. The crisis of globalization. The most important thing to deal with confrontational conflicts. The most fundamental shift is to move towards peaceful development. Only the domestic cycle of harmonious coexistence between man and nature. To change it out, the one that relies too much on an export-oriented economy, you have to get involved in international conflicts, that development model. So we need to shift towards peaceful development. It has to be a harmonious coexistence between man and nature. Shift to ecology. All right. So that's it for what I'm going to tell you about today. Thank you very much.